Naomi, please, let me explain.
Explain what? How you betrayed your wife or how you stole your own daughter's best friend? Mrs. Calloway, I'm sorry. I never meant for you to find out like this. And I treated you like family. The moment I opened that bedroom door, every memory we ever made together died.
The day I caught my husband in bed with my daughter's best friend, I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I didn't even cry. I stood there with my hand still wrapped around the doorknob, listening to my own heartbeat because I was terrified that if I breathed too loudly, the life I had spent 24 years building would disappear right in front of me. What broke me wasn't seeing my husband, Everett Calloway. It wasn't seeing 18-year-old Harper Monroe, the same girl who had eaten dinner at my table, laughed in my kitchen, called me Mrs. Calloway, and hugged me every Christmas. What destroyed me was hearing her whisper 6 words that still haunt every quiet moment of my life. She can never find out, Everett. The truth was, I had already found out. And neither of them had any idea that what happened during the next 30 days would expose secrets far bigger than an affair. My name is Naomi Calloway, and this is the story of how the 2 people I trusted most almost destroyed my family, until one forgotten photograph changed everything. Before we go any further, tell us the city you're watching from in the comments. I always enjoy seeing people join us from all over the world. And if you love emotional stories filled with shocking twists and unforgettable endings, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications because we have many more stories just like this waiting for you. Now, let me tell you how everything began. For 24 years, I believed I had built the kind of marriage people secretly wished they had. Everett wasn't flashy or overly romantic, but he was dependable. At least, that was the version everyone else saw. We met during our sophomore year at the University of Michigan, married before either of us had real careers, struggled through tiny apartments, unpaid bills, and years when every dollar mattered. Together, we raised our only daughter, Lila, in a quiet neighborhood outside Seattle, where people waved from their front porches and children still rode bicycles until sunset. I worked as an interior designer while Everett built a respected financial consulting business. From the outside, we looked like the couple who had figured life out. We hosted Thanksgiving every year. Friends asked us for marriage advice. Neighbors joked that we would probably grow old, sitting on matching rocking chairs. Looking back now, I realize people only see what you allow them to see. They never notice the small cracks unless they're standing inside the house with you. I often replay the months before everything collapsed because the warning signs seem painfully obvious now. Everett started protecting his phone like it contained government secrets. He suddenly cared about expensive cologne even when he claimed he was only meeting longtime clients. He began going to the gym every evening after work, something he had never shown interest in before. When I asked simple questions, his answers became shorter, almost rehearsed. I blamed stress. His company had recently landed several major contracts, and I convinced myself success simply came with pressure. After all, marriages survive difficult seasons. That's what I kept telling myself. I had no reason to imagine that while I was worrying about deadlines and helping our daughter prepare for college applications, my husband had already begun crossing a line that no family should ever have to face. If someone had asked me then whether I trusted Harper Monroe, I would have answered without hesitation. I trusted her the same way I trusted my own daughter. She had practically grown up inside our house. She and Lila became inseparable during freshman year of high school, after being paired together for a history project. What started as after-school study sessions slowly became sleepovers, birthday parties, weekend shopping trips, movie nights stretched long past midnight, and summers spent laughing beside our backyard pool. Harper was the kind of teenager who could brighten a room simply by walking into it. She had an easy smile that made people lower their guard, and a confidence that seemed unusual for someone her age. She was polite, respectful, and thoughtful enough to remember my birthday every single year. She always brought me flowers on Mother's Day, insisting that, because her own mother lived several states away for work, I deserved to be celebrated too. Every time she wrapped her arms around me and thanked me for treating her like family, I believed every word she said. Her parents divorced when she was 12. Her father relocated to Arizona, while her mother accepted a demanding corporate position in Boston that required constant travel. Harper stayed with her grandmother most of the year, but whenever school breaks arrived, she seemed happier spending time at our house than anywhere else. I never questioned it. I admired her resilience. Looking back, I realized that sympathy can sometimes blind you to things your instincts are quietly trying to reveal. I wanted her to feel safe, loved, and welcomed. I wanted her to have the stability she seemed to be missing. Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing her as Lila's friend and started thinking of her as another daughter. I bought an extra stocking for Christmas because I knew she would be with us. I kept her favorite cereal in the pantry without anyone asking. She had her own towel in the upstairs bathroom and her own drawer in the guest room. She wasn't a visitor anymore. She belonged in our home, or at least I thought she did. Everett always treated Harper kindly, but in those early years, nothing about their interactions seemed unusual. He called her kiddo whenever she walked through the front door, asked about her grades, teased her whenever she beat him at board games, and insisted she help him taste test whatever new recipe he was trying on the backyard grill. He had always been good with young people. Our nieces adored him. The neighborhood children followed him around during block parties because he somehow remembered every one of their names. Watching him encourage Harper felt completely natural. If anything, it made me proud to have married someone who knew how to make other people feel included. Never once did my mind wander anywhere inappropriate. It simply wasn't the kind of thought that could exist in a healthy marriage. Or at least, that's what I believed. The first moment that returns to me now happened almost 2 years before everything exploded. At the time, it seemed so insignificant that I forgot about it within minutes. We were hosting Lila's 18th birthday barbecue. Friends filled the backyard with music, laughter, and conversations that drifted across the evening air. I had stepped inside to refill a serving tray when I glanced through the kitchen window toward the patio. Everett was standing beside Harper, laughing about something she had said. She reached over and brushed a small smear of barbecue sauce off the front of his shirt. He smiled at her in a way I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't inappropriate. It was simply different. There was an unfamiliar softness in his eyes that lingered a second longer than it should have. Before I could think anything of it, Lila ran across the yard yelling for everyone to gather around the birthday cake. The moment disappeared as quickly as it came, buried beneath candles, photographs, and applause. Months passed without another thought. Life carried us forward the way it always does. Lila graduated high school with honors and earned admission to the University of Washington. The entire family celebrated because she would only be a few hours away from home. Harper chose a different path, enrolling at a private university closer to Seattle, after receiving a generous academic scholarship. Even after graduation, the girls remained inseparable. Harper continued visiting our house almost every weekend. Sometimes she arrived before Lila did. Other times she stayed after Lila left, helping me clean the kitchen or talking about classes while Everett watched football in the living room. I admired how responsible she had become. She spoke confidently about internships, career goals, and eventually attending law school. She seemed determined to build the future she had always dreamed about. I remember telling friends how proud I was of her, almost as if she were my own child. Then little things began happening that made no sense on their own. Everett suddenly knew details about Harper's class schedule before Lila mentioned them. He remembered the dates of her exams. He somehow knew she had changed majors before I heard it from either of the girls. Whenever Harper texted the family group chat, Everett often responded within seconds, even during work meetings when he usually ignored everyone else's messages. I noticed it, but I explained it away. Harper had become part of our extended family. Of course he cared about how she was doing. Of course he wanted to encourage her. That was the kind of man he had always appeared to be. The first time something truly unsettled me happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I had left work early after one of my appointments was canceled. Walking into the house, I expected complete silence because Everett had told me he was spending the day in Portland meeting a new client. Instead, I heard voices coming from the kitchen. Harper was there, standing at the island with a cup of coffee in her hands. Everett stood across from her. The conversation stopped the instant they noticed me. Neither of them looked frightened, but they looked interrupted. Everett quickly explained that his Portland meeting had been postponed, and Harper had simply stopped by to borrow one of Lila's textbooks. Harper smiled, hugged me, and repeated the same explanation almost word for word. Their story made perfect sense. Yet, for reasons I still couldn't explain, an uncomfortable feeling settled quietly inside my chest. That night, after Harper left, I asked Everett why he hadn't mentioned that she was coming over. He laughed softly, kissed my forehead, and told me I was overthinking something completely innocent. "She's practically our kid, Naomi," he said. "Do I need permission every time someone comes by the house?" I remember feeling embarrassed for even asking. I apologized almost immediately. He wrapped his arm around me, told me I was exhausted from work, and suggested we order takeout instead of cooking dinner. Within an hour, I had convinced myself that the strange feeling was nothing more than stress. Marriage requires trust, and I refused to become the kind of wife who searched for problems where none existed. If only I had listened to that quiet voice inside me that afternoon, I might have discovered the truth before it had the chance to grow into something that would change every single life connected to our family. I had no idea that while I was apologizing for asking one simple question, Harper had already crossed a line that should never have been crossed. And neither of them realized that someone else had started noticing things too. My daughter Lila hadn't said a word to me yet, but she had already begun keeping a secret of her own. Lila had always been terrible at hiding her emotions. Even as a little girl, I could tell when she had broken a vase or forgotten to finish her homework simply by looking at her face. She inherited that from me. We both wore our hearts where people could see them. So when she came home one Sunday afternoon and barely looked at either her father or Harper, I noticed immediately. At first, I assumed she had argued with someone at school or was overwhelmed by her coursework. College had been more demanding than she expected, and I knew she was carrying a heavy schedule. I asked if everything was all right, but she smiled too quickly and told me she was just tired. It was the kind of answer children give when they desperately want their parents to stop asking questions. Over the following weeks, the easy friendship between Lila and Harper began to change in ways that were almost impossible to describe. They still spent time together, but something felt different. The laughter that usually filled our living room became shorter. Their conversations seemed careful, almost measured, as if they were both avoiding certain topics. Sometimes I would walk into the kitchen and they would immediately stop talking. I blamed myself for imagining things. Young adults grow apart sometimes. Friendships evolve. I reminded myself that not every silence meant there was a problem. Still, a mother's instincts have a way of whispering long before they start shouting. One Friday evening, Lila surprised me by asking if we could have dinner together, just the two of us. Everett had a business dinner, or at least that was what he told us, and Harper had supposedly driven back to campus after class. We went to our favorite little Italian restaurant, overlooking the marina. It was the same place where Lila had celebrated her 16th birthday, and where we had quietly celebrated every major milestone since then. She barely touched her food. She kept stirring her pasta while staring out at the boats rocking gently against the docks. I waited, knowing she would speak when she was ready. Finally, she looked at me and asked a question that caught me completely off guard. "Mom, do you ever feel like people can change without realizing they're changing?" I smiled gently, thinking she was talking about college or relationships. "I think everyone changes," I answered. "The important thing is whether they remember who they are." She nodded, but her eyes stayed fixed on the window. What if someone you trusted started acting different? I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Did something happen with Harper? She hesitated for several long seconds before shaking her head. No, forget I asked. She forced a smile, changed the subject, and spent the rest of dinner asking about one of my recent design projects. By the time we drove home, I had convinced myself she was simply dealing with ordinary college drama. Looking back now, I realize she had been giving me an opportunity to ask one more question. One question that might have changed everything. Instead, I let the moment slip away. Around the same time, Everett seemed to become strangely interested in looking younger. He replaced half his wardrobe with expensive fitted shirts, started whitening his teeth, bought a new luxury watch he insisted had been discounted, and even changed the cologne he had worn for nearly 15 years. When I joked that he was having a midlife crisis, he laughed harder than the joke deserved. "You think I can't look good for my own wife?" he teased. "I've never complained," I replied. "Good. Then enjoy the upgrade." I laughed with him, but something about the exchange lingered in my mind. Everett had never cared much about fashion before. Suddenly, every mirror became an opportunity to adjust his hair or straighten his jacket. Every business trip seemed to require another new outfit. I told myself, successful people often reinvent themselves. There was always a reasonable explanation. I had become an expert at finding them. Then came the charity gala. Every spring, our community hosted a fundraising event for children's hospitals. Everett and I attended every year. Lila came whenever her schedule allowed, and this year, Harper joined us after receiving an invitation through one of the university volunteer programs. She arrived wearing a simple navy blue dress that was elegant without trying too hard. She looked mature, polished, and far older than the teenager who used to borrow pajamas from our guest room. As the evening unfolded, I found myself speaking with several clients while Everett moved through the ballroom greeting business associates. At one point, I glanced across the room and saw him standing beside Harper near one of the tall windows overlooking the city skyline. They weren't doing anything inappropriate. They were simply talking. Yet something about the way they focused entirely on each other made the crowded ballroom seem to disappear around them. Harper laughed at something he said, lightly touching his arm for a brief second before stepping back. Everett smiled in a way I hadn't seen directed toward me in a very long time. The feeling that settled over me wasn't jealousy. It was confusion. I couldn't explain why such an ordinary interaction suddenly felt uncomfortable. When I walked toward them, they both looked up almost simultaneously. "There you are," Everett said warmly. Harper was telling me about an internship interview. I congratulated her, hugged her, and joined the conversation. Within moments, everything felt perfectly normal again. The strange feeling faded, leaving me embarrassed for questioning people I loved. But the evening wasn't over. As guests began leaving, I realized I had left my shawl in the ballroom. I returned alone while Everett brought the car round to the entrance. The room was nearly empty. Staff members were clearing tables and stacking chairs. That's when I saw Harper standing near the hallway leading toward the elevators. She wasn't alone. She was staring down at her phone with an expression I had never seen before. Anxious, almost frightened. Before she noticed me, her screen lit up. I wasn't close enough to read the entire message. I only caught the sender's name before she quickly locked the phone and slipped it into her purse. Everett. For a brief second, I stood frozen. Then my rational mind rushed in with explanation after explanation. Maybe he was coordinating where to pick everyone up. Maybe he was asking whether she'd found her ride. Maybe he'd accidentally texted her instead of me. By the time Harper smiled and walked over to thank me for inviting her, I had already buried the questions. On the drive home, Everett talked about donations, networking, and future business opportunities, as though nothing unusual had happened. I almost mentioned seeing his name on Harper's phone. Instead, I stared out the passenger window while the rain slid slowly across the glass. Sometimes the truth doesn't arrive all at once. Sometimes it introduces itself so gently that you mistake it for coincidence. Over the next few days, those coincidences became impossible to ignore. Everett started stepping outside whenever his phone rang. Harper suddenly stopped coming over as often, but somehow Everett always seemed to know exactly where she was. And then one Tuesday afternoon, while folding laundry upstairs, I found a receipt in the pocket of Everett's jacket. It wasn't for a business lunch. It wasn't for a client meeting. It was for an upscale cafe on the opposite side of the city. The receipt showed 2 meals, 2 coffees, 1 dessert. The date printed across the top was the same afternoon Everett had told me he had skipped lunch because meetings had run late. I stood there holding that tiny piece of paper for several minutes. For the first time in 24 years of marriage, I didn't wonder if my husband was lying. I wondered how many lies I had already believed. I wish I could tell you that the receipt was enough to make me confront Everett. I wish I could say I demanded answers, searched his phone, or followed him the very next day. But that isn't how most marriages fall apart. They don't collapse in one dramatic moment. They erode one unanswered question at a time. Every suspicious detail gets buried beneath years of shared memories, anniversaries, family vacations, and promises that once felt unbreakable. I had loved Everett for nearly half my life. That kind of history doesn't disappear because of one receipt tucked inside a jacket pocket. So instead of accusing him, I did what so many wives do when they desperately want to be wrong. I convinced myself there had to be another explanation. For nearly 3 weeks, I watched quietly. I wasn't spying. I simply started paying attention to things I had ignored before. Everett had become remarkably careful with his schedule. He always seemed to have a meeting that couldn't be postponed, a client who suddenly needed him across town, or a networking dinner that lasted longer than expected. The strange part wasn't how busy he had become. It was how predictable his excuses sounded. Every explanation arrived almost too quickly, as though he had practiced them long before I asked. I noticed something else as well. Whenever Harper came up in conversation, Everett answered before anyone else could. If Lila mentioned that Harper had an exam, Everett somehow already knew how it had gone. If I wondered aloud whether Harper had settled into her new apartment near campus, he casually mentioned that she seemed to like the neighborhood. Every answer felt ordinary until I asked myself one simple question. How did he know all of this before the rest of us? That question refused to leave me alone. It followed me through grocery stores, work meetings, sleepless nights, and quiet mornings with coffee. I found myself remembering dozens of little moments I had dismissed over the previous year. Harper arriving at our house when Leela wasn't home, Everett offering to drive her back to campus because it was on his way. The way they occasionally shared private jokes that I didn't understand. None of those memories proved anything by themselves. Together, however, they painted a picture I didn't want to recognize. Still, I wasn't ready to believe it. There is something incredibly painful about reaching the point where your heart and your mind begin arguing with each other. My heart insisted that the man I married would never betray me this way. My mind had quietly started collecting evidence that suggested otherwise. The turning point came because of something completely ordinary. On a Wednesday morning, one of my clients canceled a design consultation less than an hour before our appointment. I suddenly found myself with an unexpected afternoon free. Instead of returning home, I decided to surprise Everett with lunch. It had been weeks since we'd spent time together, without distractions. I even smiled while driving to his office, imagining the look on his face when I walked in carrying his favorite sandwiches from the deli downtown. For a brief moment, I honestly believed that maybe reconnecting was exactly what our marriage needed. Maybe all the distance between us came from busy schedules. Maybe we had simply forgotten to make time for each other. When I arrived at his office building, the receptionist greeted me warmly. She had known us for years, but the smile on her face faded slightly when I asked to see Everett. "Oh," she said politely. "Mr. Calloway left about 45 minutes ago." I frowned. "He told me he had meetings all afternoon." She glanced toward the conference rooms before looking back at me. "He canceled those this morning." She didn't realize what those words meant to me. To her, it was just a schedule change. To me, it was the first undeniable confirmation that Everett had lied directly to my face. I thanked her, carried the untouched lunch back to my car, and sat behind the steering wheel without starting the engine. My hands rested motionless on the paper bag, while questions raced through my mind. Where had he gone? Why lie about something so simple? If he wasn't working, then who was important enough for him to invent an entire afternoon of meetings? For the first time in our marriage, I made a decision I never imagined I would make. I followed my husband. His black SUV wasn't difficult to find. I spotted it leaving a traffic light nearly 3 blocks from his office and stayed several cars behind. Every part of me hoped he was driving toward another client, another office, another explanation that would make me ashamed of doubting him. Instead, he headed toward the northern edge of the city, where boutique cafes, luxury apartments, and quiet parks overlooked the waterfront. He finally pulled into the parking garage of an upscale apartment complex I had never visited before. I parked across the street. For nearly 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then, Harper stepped out of the building. Even now, I can still picture exactly what she was wearing: a cream-colored sweater, light blue jeans, white sneakers, her hair pulled into a loose ponytail that bounced gently as she walked. She looked relaxed, comfortable. She wasn't looking around nervously. She wasn't afraid of being seen. She climbed into Everett's passenger seat as naturally as if they had done it 100 times before. My entire body went numb. I couldn't hear the traffic anymore. I couldn't feel my hands gripping the steering wheel. All I could do was watch. They drove away together. I followed again, barely remembering the route, because my thoughts had become louder than everything happening outside the windshield. They eventually stopped at a quiet lakeside cafe, tucked away from the busy streets. It wasn't crowded. It wasn't the kind of place people accidentally wandered into. It was private. I parked far enough away that they wouldn't notice me. Through the large front windows, I watched them sit across from each other. At first, they looked exactly like friends, sharing lunch. Then Everett reached across the table. He took Harper's hand. She didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled. Not the polite smile she always gave our family. This one was different. It carried familiarity, comfort, affection. I felt something inside me crack. I don't remember crying. I don't remember feeling angry. What I remember most was an overwhelming silence. The kind of silence that arrives when your entire understanding of your own life changes in a single moment. I stayed there for almost an hour, unable to leave. I watched them laugh. I watched them lean toward each other while talking. I watched Everett brush a strand of hair away from Harper's face with a tenderness I hadn't felt from him in months. There was no misunderstanding anymore. No reasonable explanation. No coincidence. My husband wasn't having lunch with my daughter's friend. He was sharing a life with her that I knew nothing about. I drove home before they left the cafe because I couldn't bear watching another second. The entire drive, one thought, repeated over and over in my mind. How long? Not why. Not how. How long? How many family dinners had they sat across from each other, pretending nothing was happening? How many holidays? How many birthdays? How many photographs hanging on my walls had captured two people hiding the same secret? When I walked through my front door, the house felt unfamiliar. Every picture frame suddenly looked like evidence. Every family memory felt rewritten. I wandered into the living room and stared at the photographs lining the fireplace. There was Harper at Christmas. Harper at Lila's graduation. Harper blowing out candles at her 19th birthday while Everett stood beside her, smiling proudly. I had looked at those pictures hundreds of times. Now I was seeing them for the first time. That evening, Everett came home carrying flowers. He kissed my cheek, asked about my day, told me his meetings had been exhausting. And then he looked directly into my eyes and lied again. I smiled. I thanked him for the flowers. I served him dinner. I listened to him describe meetings that had never happened. Because in that moment, I realized something important. If Everett had been living a lie for this long, then I needed to stop reacting like a heartbroken wife. I needed to start thinking like someone searching for the whole truth. And I had no idea that the truth waiting for me was even more devastating than the affair itself. People often ask what betrayal feels like. They imagine rage. They imagine shattered glass, screaming, or someone packing a suitcase in the middle of the night. My experience was nothing like that. Betrayal was much quieter. It sat beside me while I folded laundry. It followed me through grocery stores. It stared back at me every time I looked in the mirror. The hardest part wasn't pretending everything was normal for Everett. It was pretending everything was normal for Lila. Every time she smiled at her father, I felt a knot tighten inside my chest because she had no idea the man she admired was slowly tearing apart the foundation of our family. I wanted to protect her from the truth for as long as I could, but I also knew that every day I remained silent gave Everett another opportunity to continue living two completely different lives. For the next several days, I became someone I barely recognized. I wasn't trying to catch Everett making another mistake because I already knew he was having an affair. What I needed to know now was how deep it went. Had it lasted weeks, months, years? Was Harper simply someone he had manipulated? Or had she willingly betrayed every memory our family had shared together? Those questions became impossible to ignore. I stopped confronting my emotions and started observing details. Everett's habits became almost mechanical once I paid attention. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he claimed to have late client meetings. Every Saturday morning, he suddenly developed a routine of early golf with business associates I'd never actually met. His phone never left his pocket, not even when he showered. He changed passwords I had known for years. The man who once left his laptop open on the dining room table now closed it the second I walked into the room. One Saturday morning, Everett kissed my forehead before leaving with his golf clubs resting in the back of his SUV. He smiled exactly the way he always had. "I'll be back around 2, he said. "Have fun," I answered. The moment his car disappeared around the corner, I walked upstairs. For almost 10 minutes, I stood outside his home office without touching the doorknob. I had never searched through my husband's things before. 24 years of marriage had never required it. Crossing that doorway felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But another thought kept repeating itself. Everett had crossed far greater lines without giving me the dignity of the truth. Slowly, I opened the door. The room looked exactly as it always had. Books neatly arranged across dark wooden shelves. Family photographs displayed beside framed business awards. His desk perfectly organized. If a stranger had walked in, they would have seen the office of a successful businessman who loved his family. I almost laughed at how convincing appearances could be. I began with simple drawers filled with paperwork, tax documents, and office supplies. Nothing unusual. Then I noticed a small locked cabinet beneath one side of the desk. I had forgotten it even existed because Everett rarely used it. At first, I couldn't open it. I searched around the office before remembering the spare keys we kept inside an old wooden box downstairs for emergencies. My hand shook as I returned and slid the tiny key into the lock. The cabinet opened with almost no resistance. Inside was a slim leather folder. Nothing more. For a moment, I wondered whether I had imagined everything. Then I opened it. There were receipts from expensive restaurants I had never visited. Hotel reservations made during weekends, Everett claimed he was attending financial conferences. Gift receipts for jewelry I had never received. Every page felt heavier than the last. Then I found a small envelope tucked inside one of the folders. It contained printed photographs. The first one showed Everett and Harper walking through a botanical garden, smiling at each other. The second captured them sitting together on a beach, her head resting comfortably against his shoulder. The third made it impossible to breathe. They were kissing. Not the awkward kiss of two people making a terrible mistake. The kiss belonged to two people who believed they were in love. I dropped the photographs onto the desk and stepped backward as though they might somehow burn my hands. Every excuse I had made over the past year disappeared forever. This wasn't a recent affair. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't hidden beneath guilt. It was a relationship. I don't know how long I stood there before noticing something folded beneath the photographs. It was a handwritten letter. The handwriting wasn't Everett's. It belonged to Harper. I recognized it immediately from the birthday cards she had given our family over the years. My eyes scanned the first few lines. She thanked Everett for believing in her. She wrote that she had never imagined falling in love with someone who made her feel safe. She said she hated pretending to be just Lila's friend. And then I reached the sentence that completely changed everything. I know we're waiting until after Lila graduates before telling everyone about us. I read those words again, then again, waiting, telling everyone about us. My knees nearly gave out beneath me. This wasn't an affair they planned to end. They had been planning a future together. While I was decorating our home for holidays, while Lila invited Harper to family dinners, while I proudly introduced Everett as my husband, they had been making plans. I carefully returned every document to the folder exactly as I had found it. I didn't want Everett realizing I knew the truth. Not yet. My emotions wanted confrontation. My mind wanted answers. As I closed the cabinet, I heard the front door downstairs. Panic rushed through me. Everett wasn't supposed to be home for another 2 hours. I quickly locked the cabinet, returned the key to my pocket, and stepped into the hallway just as he walked upstairs. He smiled. "The course closed early," he explained. Rain. I looked past him through the bedroom window. The sky was bright blue, not a single cloud. For one brief second, I wondered if he realized I knew he was lying. If he did, he never showed it. That evening, something happened that neither Everett nor Harper could have anticipated. Lila came home unexpectedly. She walked into the kitchen, looked at both of us sitting at the table, and asked if we could talk after dinner. There was something different about her voice. It wasn't nervous anymore. It sounded resolved. After Everett went upstairs to answer what he claimed was another business call, Lila led me onto the back patio. She stared into the backyard for several moments before speaking. "Mom," her voice trembled, "I've been keeping something from you because I didn't know how to say it. I felt my heartbeat quicken." She reached into her backpack and removed her phone. Then she handed it to me. "I think you need to see these." On the screen was a series of photographs. Some were blurry, others were painfully clear. Everett, Harper, holding hands, leaving restaurants, walking together downtown. Entering the same apartment building I had followed him to weeks earlier, my hands started trembling. "Lila," she lowered her eyes, "I've known for almost 4 months." The words struck harder than anything I had discovered inside Everett's office. "You knew?" She nodded slowly, tears filling her eyes. "I caught them by accident after one of my classes. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Then, I started seeing them together, again and again." I wrapped my arms around my daughter as she broke down crying. Between sobs, she whispered something that shattered what little remained of my heart. I kept hoping Dad would stop. I held her tighter. Then she whispered one final sentence. "I ended my friendship with Harper 3 weeks ago, and she never even asked me why." In that moment, I realized something that made the betrayal even more painful. Harper hadn't just chosen my husband over me. She had chosen him over my daughter, too. And as Lila cried in my arms, I made a promise to myself. The next time Everett looked into my eyes, he would finally hear the truth I had been carrying alone. But neither of us knew that his biggest secret wasn't waiting inside a hidden folder. It was waiting for him at our dining room table. The conversation that would happen the following evening would change every one of our lives forever. The strange thing about carrying the truth is that it changes the way you look at people. The morning after Lila showed me the photographs, I watched Everett pour himself a cup of coffee as though nothing had happened. He asked whether I needed anything from the grocery store. He reminded me that we had dinner reservations with friends the following weekend. He even kissed the top of my head before leaving for work. Every gesture looked exactly the same as it had for years, yet none of it felt familiar anymore. I wasn't looking at the man I had married. I was looking at a man who had mastered the art of lying to the people who loved him most. Oddly enough, I wasn't crying anymore. The tears had already done their job. What remained was clarity. For the first time since discovering the affair, I wasn't wondering what Everett was hiding. I already knew enough. The only thing left was deciding how his carefully constructed world would finally come crashing down. Lila wanted me to expose him immediately. She wanted to call him into the living room, place the photographs on the coffee table, and ask him to explain how he could betray both his wife and his daughter in the same breath. I understood her anger because I felt it too. But anger has a way of ending conversations before the whole truth has a chance to come out. I didn't want another lie. I didn't want another excuse. I wanted Everett to look me in the eyes and realize there was nowhere left to run. I asked Lila to trust me for one more day. She reluctantly agreed, though I could see the disappointment on her face. She had spent months carrying a burden that never should have belonged to her. She deserved answers just as much as I did. That afternoon, I made one phone call I never imagined I would have to make. I called Harper. My voice remained calm enough that she never suspected anything. "Hi, sweetheart," I said. "It's been a while since we've all had dinner together. Why don't you come over tomorrow evening? Lila will be here too." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "Really?" she asked. "Of course," I answered. "Your family." For a moment, I almost laughed at the irony of those words. She accepted the invitation without hesitation. Then I called Everett. "I thought it would be nice if we had everyone over tomorrow," I told him. "I'd love that," he replied. His voice sounded genuinely pleased. Neither of them had the slightest idea that the dinner they had just agreed to attend would be the last time they ever sat at my table, as though they belonged there. The following evening arrived with an almost unbearable sense of normalcy. I cooked Everett's favorite herb-roasted chicken, prepared mashed potatoes exactly the way Lila liked them, and baked Harper's favorite apple pie. Every familiar routine felt surreal. I wasn't preparing a family dinner. I was preparing the final chapter of a life I could never return to. By 6:30, everyone had arrived. Lila barely acknowledged Harper when she walked through the front door. Harper seemed uncomfortable, but tried to pretend everything was fine. Everett noticed the tension and asked if something had happened between the girls. "No," Lila answered calmly. "Nothing at all." I looked at my daughter and silently admired her strength. 4 months of carrying that secret had forced her to grow up far too quickly. Dinner passed with awkward conversation. Everett talked about business. Harper discussed one of her university classes. I contributed just enough to keep the conversation moving, while Lila remained unusually quiet. Every few minutes, I caught Everett and Harper exchanging quick glances. Before discovering the affair, I would never have noticed them. Now, they seemed impossible to miss. They weren't looking at each other because they happened to be sitting across the table. They were checking on one another, making sure the other was comfortable. It was the silent language of two people sharing a secret. When dessert was finished, I stood up and quietly collected the plates. No one leave just yet, I said. There's something I'd like us to talk about. Everett smiled. Sounds serious. It is. I returned to the dining room carrying a large envelope instead of coffee. I placed it gently in the center of the table. Nobody spoke. I slowly removed the first photograph and laid it in front of Everett. It showed him holding Harper's hand outside the tasked Lakeside Cafe. His smile disappeared instantly. The second photograph showed them entering the apartment building together. The third showed them kissing. Harper's face turned completely pale. Lila lowered her eyes. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply asked one question. How long? The silence that followed felt endless. Everett looked from the photographs to Harper, then back to me. Naomi, how long? This time my voice was firmer. He swallowed hard. A little over a year. A year. 365 days of lies. 365 days of family dinners, birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, and ordinary mornings built on deception. I turned toward Harper. You looked me in the eyes every single week. You hugged me. You thanked me for treating you like family. Did any of it mean anything to you? Tears rolled down her cheeks. I'm so sorry. I gently shook my head. That's not an answer. She struggled to speak. I never planned for this to happen, but it did. I fell in love with him. Those 6 words settled over the room like a weight no one could lift. Lila finally looked directly at Harper. You didn't just betray my mom. Her voice cracked. You betrayed me. Harper reached toward her instinctively. Lila, don't. That single word carried years of friendship breaking apart forever. Then I looked back at Everett. I found the letter. His expression changed immediately. He knew exactly which letter I meant. I know about your plans. He closed his eyes. There were never supposed to be plans. I stared at him in disbelief. You were waiting until our daughter graduated so you could tell everyone about your relationship. He didn't deny it. Instead, he whispered the sentence I never expected to hear. I convinced myself I could make it right. I almost couldn't believe those words. Make what right, Everett? The damage. The damage was already done the moment you chose her. He covered his face with both hands. For the first time since all of this began, I saw genuine shame. Not because he had been caught, because he finally understood who had paid the highest price. Lila stood up. I spent months wondering what I did wrong. She looked directly at her father. I thought maybe you stopped loving our family because of something I couldn't see. Everett immediately stood. No, sweetheart. She stepped backward before he could come closer. You made my best friend a stranger. Then she turned toward Harper. And you made my home feel unsafe. Neither of them had a response. The silence that followed said everything words never could. I took a slow breath before speaking one final. Time. Everett, tomorrow morning your attorney can contact mine. He nodded. There was no argument, no denial, no promises to change. Deep down, I think he knew there were some decisions that could never be undone. Harper quietly picked up her purse. She paused beside me with tears streaming down her face. I know you may never forgive me. I met her eyes one last time. The hardest part isn't losing my fime. Marriage. She looked at me silently. It's realizing that every time I called you my second daughter, you already knew you were taking my family away from me. She broke down crying before walking out the front door without looking back. Everett remained standing in the dining room for several more seconds. The house was completely silent. Then he picked up his car keys. He looked at me as though searching for one final chance. There wasn't one. Without saying another word, he walked out the same front door. The sound of it closing behind him echoed through the house. That was the last night we ever lived under the same roof. The divorce was finalized 9 months later. Everett tried several times to apologize, but apologies cannot rebuild trust that has been broken so completely. Harper eventually transferred to another university and disappeared from our lives. I genuinely hope she found the wisdom she lacked when she was young, because carrying the weight of choices like those is something that follows a person for years. As for Lila, healing took time. Losing a father and a best friend in the same season left wounds that didn't disappear overnight. We went to counseling together. We learned that grief isn't only about losing people through death. Sometimes it's about accepting that the people you loved no longer exist in the way you believed they did. As for me, I eventually realized that my story wasn't really about catching my husband with someone younger. It was about discovering my own strength after spending too many years believing my happiness depended on someone else's loyalty. Everett didn't destroy my future. He destroyed the version of it that included him. Those are two very different things. Today, when I look at old family photographs, I no longer see the lies first. I see a woman who loved deeply, trusted completely, and still found the courage to stand up when that trust was shattered. If my story teaches anything, I hope it's this. Betrayal can change your life in a single moment, but it does not have to define the rest of it. Sometimes, the strongest thing a person can do isn't holding on to someone who keeps breaking their heart. Sometimes, the strongest thing is quietly closing the door behind them and finally walking toward a life built on truth. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe someone who betrays both their spouse and their own child's trust deserves a second chance? Or are there some lines that should never be crossed? Share your opinion in the comments, because every perspective tells a different story. And if you enjoy powerful, emotional stories that stay with you long after they're over, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. We have many more unforgettable stories waiting for you. Until next time, take care of yourself, cherish the people who truly value your trust, and thank you for watching.